The silence in that wedding hall was so deafening, you could hear a pin drop on marble. 97 guests, all dressed in their finest attire, sat frozen like statues as my daughter-in-law's words echoed through the sacred space. "I'm pregnant with your fiancé." The wedding cake, a 3-tier masterpiece that cost me $2,400, stood untouched as chaos erupted in my perfectly planned world. But let me back up and tell you how I, Patricia Reynolds, a 66-year-old retired school principal from Austin, Texas, found myself in the most humiliating moment of my life. For 38 years, I dedicated my life to education, saving every penny of my $52,000 annual salary, living modestly in my small 2-bedroom house on Maple Street. I raised my son Michael as a single mother after his father abandoned us when Michael was just 3 years old. I sacrificed designer clothes, vacations, and even my own dreams of remarrying to give my boy everything he needed. Michael grew up to become a successful architect, earning $95,000 a year, and I couldn't have been prouder. 2 years ago, he introduced me to Melissa, a stunning 32-year-old marketing executive with honey blonde hair and the kind of smile that could light up a room. She was charming, intelligent, and seemed genuinely in love with my son. I welcomed her into our family with open arms, even though something in her eyes always made me slightly uneasy. The wedding was planned for months. I had spent $15,000 of my retirement savings to help make their special day perfect. Everything from the venue at the historic Driscoll Hotel to the fresh flower arrangements, the photographer, and even Melissa's alterations. I covered it all because I wanted my son to have the wedding of his dreams. That morning, September 15th, started like any fairy tale. The autumn sun streamed through the stained glass windows of St. Mary's Cathedral, casting rainbow patterns across the wooden pews. I wore my navy blue mother of the groom dress, the one I'd saved 3 months to buy, and felt genuinely happy for the first time in years. Michael looked handsome in his black tuxedo, nervously adjusting his tie every few minutes. The ceremony began beautifully. The organ played Pachelbel's canon. Melissa walked down the aisle in her $3,200 gown, and I dabbed my eyes with the lace handkerchief that had belonged to my mother. Everything was perfect until the moment Father Martinez asked if anyone had a reason why these two should not be joined in matrimony. That's when Melissa turned toward the congregation, her face flushed with what I initially thought was bridal nerves, and dropped the bomb that would shatter everything. "I'm pregnant with your fiancé," she shouted, pointing directly at me with a trembling finger. The words hit me like a physical blow. My heart stopped beating for what felt like an eternity. Michael's face went completely white, and he stumbled backward as if someone had pushed him. The guests erupted in gasps and whispers. Phones immediately came out to record the drama, and I felt the weight of 97 pairs of eyes boring into me. But here's the thing about being a school principal for nearly 4 decades. You learn to think quickly under pressure. You develop an instinct for reading people, for sensing when something doesn't add up. And in that moment of absolute chaos, as Melissa stood there with tears streaming down her face and my son looking like his world had just collapsed, something clicked in my mind. I stood up slowly, my hands surprisingly steady despite the earthquake happening inside my chest. The hall fell completely silent again, waiting for my response to this devastating accusation. I looked at Melissa, then at my son, then back at the woman who had just tried to destroy my life in front of everyone I cared about. "That's great. Then you should know something," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the cathedral. I reached into my purse and pulled out my phone, my fingers surprisingly steady as I dialed a number I had memorized just that morning. "You can come in," I said into the phone, my eyes never leaving Melissa's face. When those church doors opened and the person I had been expecting walked through them, Melissa's face went from confident vindication to pure terror. My husband, yes, the husband I had secretly married 3 months ago, stared at Melissa with the same panic reflected in her eyes. If you want to know how I uncovered the web of lies that led to this moment and what happened next, please hit that like button, subscribe to this channel, and leave a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. Trust me, you won't believe how this story unfolds. 3 months before that catastrophic wedding day, I had done something that would have shocked everyone who knew me. I got married in a quiet courthouse ceremony to Harold Watson, a 68-year-old retired businessman I had met at a coffee shop 6 months earlier. Harold was distinguished, with silver hair and kind blue eyes, and he had courted me with old-fashioned charm that reminded me of the romance novels I used to read in secret. What my family didn't know was that Harold had been coming around the house when they weren't there, bringing me flowers and taking me to dinner at quiet restaurants outside of Austin. We fell in love slowly, like two teenagers afraid of getting caught. After decades of being alone, of putting everyone else's needs before my own, I finally found someone who made me feel alive again. Harold was worth approximately $1. $2 million from his successful plumbing business, but more importantly, he was worth his weight in gold when it came to character. He understood my devotion to Michael and never once made me feel guilty about the sacrifices I had made as a single mother. When I told him about spending my retirement savings on Michael's wedding, Harold simply smiled and said, "That's what mothers do for the children they love." We decided to keep our marriage secret until after Michael's wedding. I didn't want anything to overshadow his special day, and honestly, I was nervous about how he would react to me remarrying after all these years. The plan was to announce our marriage at the wedding reception during the toasts, as a joyful surprise for everyone. But 3 weeks before the wedding, Harold came to me with disturbing information. He had been doing some routine business at his bank when he overheard a conversation that made his blood run cold. Melissa was there, arguing with a loan officer about a $25,000 debt that was past due. She was frantically trying to secure a loan, claiming she needed it for family emergencies. But what caught Harold's attention was her desperation and the name she mentioned, not Michael's, but someone called Rick. Harold, being the protective man he was, decided to do some investigating. He hired a private investigator named Jenny Chen, paying her $3,500 to look into Melissa's background. What Jenny discovered over the next 2 weeks would have destroyed any normal person's faith in humanity. Melissa wasn't just a marketing executive. She was a professional con artist who had been running elaborate schemes for the past 5 years. She had previously been married to 2 other men, both significantly older and financially stable, whom she had divorced after draining their bank accounts. Her real name wasn't even Melissa Richardson. It was Carmen Rodriguez, and she had warrants out for fraud in 2 different states. But the most devastating discovery was about Rick. Rick Morrison was Melissa's actual boyfriend, an unemployed 29-year-old who was indeed the father of the child she was carrying. They had been living together in an apartment complex on the other side of town, while she maintained the facade of living in her own apartment that she showed to Michael and me. The private investigator provided us with photographs, bank records, and even recorded phone conversations between Melissa and Rick where they discussed their plan to milk the old lady and her architect's son for everything they're worth. In one particularly cruel recording, Melissa laughed about how easy it was to fool the lonely old woman who was so desperate to see her precious son married. Harold and I spent sleepless nights going through the evidence. The photos showed Melissa and Rick together at restaurants, shopping malls, and even at a clinic where she had received prenatal care, all while she was engaged to my son. The financial records revealed that she had already managed to convince Michael to co-sign for an $18,000 car loan and had access to a joint credit card with a $10,000 limit that she had nearly maxed out. My heart broke, not just for myself, but for Michael, my sweet, trusting son who worked 60-hour weeks to afford the kind of life he thought Melissa deserved. He had no idea that the woman he was planning to marry was systematically destroying his financial future while carrying another man's child. Harold held me while I cried that night, his strong arms reminding me that not all men were deceivers. "We have to tell him," I whispered against his chest. "We will," Harold promised, "but we need to be smart about this. If we just show him the evidence, she'll convince him we're lying. We need to catch her in the act." That's when we came up with our plan. We would let the wedding proceed as scheduled, but we would be ready with all the evidence and Rick himself as our ace in the hole. Harold had tracked down Rick and convinced him to cooperate by offering him $5,000 and immunity from the fraud charges if he helped us expose Melissa's scheme. The morning of the wedding, as I put on my navy dress and helped Harold adjust his tie in our secret hotel room, I never imagined that Melissa would be the one to implode the situation. We were prepared for her to go through with the wedding and fleece my son over months or years. We never expected her to have a complete breakdown at the altar. "Are you ready for this?" Harold asked me, squeezing my hand. I looked at my wedding ring, hidden under my gloves, and thought about the $20,000 I had spent on this day, the years of sacrifice, and the son I was about to save from the biggest mistake of his life. "I'm ready," I said, and meant it. The moment Harold walked through those church doors, the entire atmosphere shifted like a storm rolling in over Lake Travis. I watched Melissa's face drain of all color as she recognized the man she had been secretly meeting for weeks. Not for an affair, as she had planned to accuse me of, but because Harold had been gathering evidence of her criminal activities. You see, while Melissa thought she was being clever by following Harold and me, documenting our secret relationship to use as ammunition against me, she had actually walked straight into our trap. Harold had been letting her take photos of us together, knowing she would try to use them to discredit me when her scheme inevitably fell apart. Michael stood frozen at the altar, his face cycling through confusion, betrayal, and dawning understanding. "Mom," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the murmurs of the congregation. "What's going on? Who is this man?" Father Martinez, poor man, looked like he wished he could disappear into the marble floor. In 30 years of performing weddings, he had never witnessed anything like this melodrama unfolding in his sacred space. "Michael," I said, walking slowly down the aisle toward the altar, my voice steady despite my racing heart. "I'd like you to meet Harold Watson, my husband of 3 months." The gasp that rose from the congregation could have shattered the stained glass windows. My sister Margaret, sitting in the third pew in her $400 dress, looked like she was having a heart attack. Michael's best man, David, started laughing nervously until he realized no one else found the situation amusing. But Melissa wasn't finished with her performance. "You're lying," she screamed, pointing an accusing finger at me. "I have proof that you've been having an affair. I have pictures of you two together while Michael was working. You're a hypocrite and a cheater, just like the man who abandoned you 38 years ago." Her words were designed to cut deep, and they did. Every person in that church knew my story. How Michael's father had left us when our son was barely walking. How I had struggled to raise my boy alone while working 2 jobs and going to school at night to get my teaching degree. Harold stepped forward, his presence commanding, despite his gentle demeanor. "Melissa," he said calmly, "or should I call you Carmen Rodriguez? I think it's time we told everyone the truth." The name hit her like a physical blow. She stumbled backward, her bouquet falling to the floor and scattering white roses across the altar steps. "I don't know what you're talking about," she stammered, but her voice had lost all its conviction. Harold reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a manila envelope. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced to the congregation, "I'm sorry you all had to witness this, but Patricia and I couldn't let this wedding proceed based on lies and fraud." He opened the envelope and pulled out a photograph, one of dozens that private investigator Jenny Chen had taken over the past 2 weeks. It showed Melissa kissing a young man with dark hair outside a medical clinic. The timestamp clearly showed it was taken just 5 days earlier. "This is Rick Morrison," Harold continued, his voice carrying clearly through the now silent cathedral. "He's the real father of the baby Melissa is carrying. They've been living together for the past 8 months while she's been engaged to Michael." Michael's legs gave out, and he sat down heavily on the altar steps. The man who had always been my rock, my source of strength and pride, looked completely broken. "Is this true?" he asked Melissa, his voice cracking. Melissa's mask finally slipped completely. The charming, sweet woman who had fooled us all disappeared, replaced by someone cold and calculating. "So what if it is?" she snarled. "You think you're so special, Michael? You and your precious mommy with your middle-class dreams and your pathetic little savings account?" The cruelty in her voice made several guests gasp audibly. Mrs. Henderson, our elderly neighbor who had watched Michael grow up, started crying softly. "Do you want to know the truth?" Melissa continued, her voice rising to a near shriek. "I never loved you. You were just an easy mark, a lonely mama's boy with a decent income and a gullible old mother who was so desperate to see her son married that she'd pay for everything." The words were like arrows aimed at my heart, but I had been preparing for this moment for weeks. "And you want to know the truth, Melissa?" I replied, my voice cutting through her rant. "We've known about Rick for 2 weeks. We know about your real name, your previous marriages, your outstanding warrants, and the $47,000 in debt you've accumulated under false identities." Harold pulled out another document. We also know about the $18,000 car loan you convinced Michael to co-sign for, the $9,840 you've charged to his credit card, and the $12,000 you withdrew from the joint savings account you convinced him to open with you. The numbers hit the congregation like physical blows. These weren't just abstract concepts. This was Michael's future, his security, his trust that had been systematically destroyed by someone who claimed to love him. Michael stood up slowly, his face pale, but his jaw set with determination. "Guards!" he called out, and I realized he had hired security for the wedding, something I had thought was unnecessary at the time. 2 uniformed officers stepped forward from the back of the church. "Melissa Richardson, also known as Carmen Rodriguez," one of them announced, "you're under arrest for fraud, identity theft, and grand larceny." As they handcuffed her, Melissa turned to me one last time, her eyes blazing with hatred. "You think you've won? You dried-up old witch? This will destroy your precious son. He'll never trust another woman again because of what you've done." I looked at her calmly, drawing on every ounce of strength I had developed over 66 years of life. "Maybe," I said softly, "but at least he'll still have his dignity, his money, and his future. And most importantly, he'll still have his family, his real family." As they led her away, the church fell into stunned silence once again. The next few hours passed in a blur of police statements, canceled reception plans, and the most awkward family gathering in the history of the Reynolds family, while the congregation slowly filed out of St. Mary's Cathedral, whispering among themselves about the drama they had just witnessed. Michael, Harold, and I found ourselves in Father Martinez's office, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Michael sat in a leather chair, still wearing his tuxedo, but with his bow tie undone and hanging loose around his neck. He looked like a man who had just survived a car accident, physically unharmed but emotionally devastated. For 20 minutes, he didn't say a word, just stared at the photographs and documents Harold had spread across Father Martinez's desk. $47,000, he finally whispered, picking up the financial report. "She stole $47,000 from me, and I never even noticed." My heart broke, watching my successful, intelligent son realize how completely he had been manipulated. The joint savings account he thought contained $25,000 for their future home was completely empty. The credit cards he had given her for wedding expenses were maxed out with purchases for designer clothes, expensive dinners, and even a vacation she had taken with Rick while claiming to visit her sick grandmother. "The private investigator found receipts," Harold said gently, pulling out another folder. "She spent $3,200 of your money on a weekend getaway to San Antonio with her real boyfriend just 2 weeks ago. She told you she was at a marketing conference." Michael's hands shook as he flipped through the evidence. "Look at this," he said, his voice bitter. "She bought him a Rolex with my credit card, a $4,500 Rolex for her boyfriend, and she told me the charge was for the wedding photographer's deposit." Father Martinez, who had been quietly organizing his notes in the corner, finally spoke up. "Michael, son, I know this feels like the end of the world right now, but I've been performing weddings for 30 years, and I can tell you, it's better to discover someone's true nature before you're legally bound to them than after." The priest was right, of course, but I knew my son was thinking about more than just the money. Michael had always been a romantic, the kind of man who wrote love letters and remembered anniversaries. He had been planning to surprise Melissa with a honeymoon trip to Italy that would have cost another $8,000, money that would have disappeared into her and Rick's bank account just like everything else. "Mom," Michael said suddenly, looking up at me with tears in his eyes, "how long have you been married? And why didn't you tell me?" Harold and I exchanged glances. This was the conversation we had been dreading almost as much as exposing Melissa's fraud. 3 months, I admitted. "We got married at the courthouse on June 15th. We were planning to tell you today during the reception toasts." Michael's face cycled through hurt, confusion, and something that might have been relief. "You kept it secret for 3 months? While I was planning my wedding and talking to you about everything?" "We didn't want to take attention away from your special day," Harold explained. "Patricia was so excited about your wedding, so proud of the life you had built. She didn't want our news to overshadow yours. And then we discovered what Melissa was really up to," I added. "At that point, keeping our marriage secret became part of the plan to protect you." Michael stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the church parking lot where guests were still milling around, probably planning which restaurant they would go to for lunch instead of attending a wedding reception. "So, While I was falling in love with a con artist, you were falling in love with an honest man. The irony is pretty spectacular. Michael, I started to say, but he held up his hand. Mom, I'm not angry about you getting married. I'm hurt that you didn't trust me enough to tell me, but I understand why you kept it secret. What I can't understand is how I could be so stupid about Melissa. Harold moved closer to my son, and I could see the protective instincts that had made me fall in love with him kicking in. Son, intelligent people get fooled by con artists every day. That's what makes them good at what they do. Melissa studied you for months, learned exactly what you wanted to hear, and gave you a performance designed to make you fall in love. The detective work Harold and Jenny Chen had done revealed just how calculating Melissa's approach had been. She had researched Michael's social media accounts going back years, learned about his interests, his dreams, even his favorite foods. She had created a fake persona specifically designed to be his perfect woman. She even pretended to love jazz music, Michael said sadly, holding up a photo of Melissa and Rick at a heavy metal concert, the kind of music she had always claimed to hate. We spent so many evenings listening to Miles Davis and Coltrane, and she was faking it the entire time. Father Martinez cleared his throat. If I may suggest something, he said carefully, perhaps it would be helpful to focus on what you've gained from this experience rather than what you've lost. What have I gained? Michael asked bitterly. I've lost $50,000. My fiancé is in jail, and I'm probably going to be single for the next 20 years because I'll never trust another woman again. I stood up and walked over to my son, placing my hands on his shoulders the way I had when he was a little boy afraid of thunderstorms. You've gained the knowledge that your family will always have your back, I said firmly. You've gained the understanding that real love, like what Harold and I have, like what you deserve, doesn't require you to sacrifice your financial security or your peace of mind. And, Harold added with a slight smile, you've gained a stepfather who happens to own a very successful business and who would be honored to help you get back on your feet financially. Michael turned to look at Harold with surprise. What do you mean? I mean that I've been looking for someone to help me expand Watson Plumbing into commercial construction consulting. Someone with architectural experience who understands both design and practical building systems. The starting salary would be $75,000 plus profit sharing. For the first time since Melissa's courtroom confession, Michael smiled. It was a small smile, tentative and fragile, but it was a beginning. 2 weeks after the wedding disaster, I found myself sitting in the downtown Austin courthouse, wearing my best gray suit and clutching Harold's hand as we waited for Melissa's, or rather, Carmen Rodriguez's, first court appearance. The district attorney's office had moved quickly once they realized the scope of her criminal activities. Assistant District Attorney Jennifer Walsh, a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s, had called us in for what she termed a victim impact interview. She spread files across the conference table that painted a picture of systematic fraud spanning 3 states and at least 7 victims over the past 5 years. Mrs. Watson, she said, using my new married name for the first time in an official capacity, your son's case is actually the smallest of Carmen Rodriguez's known crimes. Her total theft amounts to over $340,000 from various victims. The number was staggering. Michael, who had insisted on attending despite my protests, went pale when he heard it. $340,000? He repeated. Her previous victim was a 72-year-old widower in Dallas named Robert Chen. Yes, related to the private investigator you hired, D.A. Walsh continued. She was engaged to him for 8 months and managed to convince him to invest $85,000 in a fake business venture. She also convinced him to take out a second mortgage on his house for another $60,000. Harold squeezed my hand tighter. The realization that Melissa's targeting of our family was part of a much larger pattern was both validating and horrifying. We weren't just unlucky, we had been carefully selected as marks by a professional criminal. The good news, D.A. Walsh continued, is that we have enough evidence to pursue multiple felony charges: grand theft, identity fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy. If convicted on all counts, she's looking at 15 to 20 years in prison. But the legal system, as we quickly learned, moves slowly. Carmen Rodriguez, now unable to make bail set at $500,000, was represented by a public defender who immediately began filing motions to delay the trial. Her strategy seemed to be to drag out the proceedings as long as possible, hoping that witnesses would become unavailable or evidence would be compromised. Meanwhile, Michael was dealing with the financial aftermath of the scam. The $18,000 car loan was still in his name, and the dealership had no sympathy for his situation. "You co-signed the loan, Mr. Reynolds," the finance manager told him coldly. "Your personal relationship with the primary borrower is not our concern." The credit card debt was equally devastating. Even though we had evidence that Carmen had made fraudulent charges, the credit card companies required police reports, court documents, and months of paperwork to reverse the charges. In the meantime, Michael's credit score was plummeting, and he was responsible for minimum payments of over $800 per month. Harold, true to his word, had not only offered Michael the job at Watson Plumbing, but had also provided him with a $25,000 personal loan at 0 interest to help cover the immediate financial crisis. "Family takes care of family," he said simply, when Michael tried to protest the generous terms. But the money was only part of the damage. Michael had developed what could only be described as relationship paranoia. He canceled his dating app subscriptions, avoided social events where he might meet women, and even seemed suspicious of female clients at his architectural firm. "I find myself analyzing every conversation," he told Harold and me over dinner one evening. "Did she ask that question because she's genuinely interested, or because she's probing for financial information? Is she being nice because she likes me, or because she's setting up a con?" Dr. Sarah Martinez, the therapist Harold had convinced Michael to see, explained that this hypervigilance was a normal response to psychological trauma. "Trust, once broken this completely, takes time to rebuild," she told us during a family session. Michael needs to understand that what happened to him wasn't his fault, and that not every woman he meets is a potential threat. The therapy sessions were costing $150 per week, another expense that Carmen's actions had forced on our family. But they were essential. Michael was struggling not just with trust issues, but with feelings of profound embarrassment and self-doubt. "The worst part," he confided during one particularly difficult session, "is feeling like everyone is looking at me and thinking, how could someone so smart be so stupid? I design buildings that have to support millions of pounds of weight. I calculate load-bearing requirements and structural integrity for a living, but I couldn't see through one lying woman." Dr. Martinez helped him understand that professional competence and personal vulnerability are completely different things. Emotional manipulation targets our basic human need for connection and love, she explained. The smartest people in the world can fall victim to it because it's not about intelligence, it's about trust and hope. 3 months after the wedding disaster, we received news that would change everything. Carmen Rodriguez had been arrested in Phoenix, Arizona, attempting to marry her 4th victim using yet another false identity. This time, she had been caught red-handed when the groom's suspicious brother had hired a private investigator who recognized her from wanted posters that Jenny Chen had distributed to private investigators across the Southwest. "This arrest in Arizona actually strengthens our case significantly," DA Walsh explained during our next meeting. "It establishes a clear pattern of behavior and shows that she's a flight risk who continued her criminal activities even while out on bail." The new arrest also revealed something we hadn't known. Rick Morrison, Carmen's boyfriend and the father of her child, had been actively participating in the scams. He had been forging documents, creating fake business entities, and even posing as various business partners during phone calls with victims. "We're now looking at this as a criminal conspiracy," DA Walsh said. "Rick Morrison is facing charges as an accomplice, and he's already indicated through his attorney that he might be willing to testify against Carmen in exchange for a reduced sentence." The news that Rick might cooperate was both encouraging and frightening. It meant the case against Carmen would be stronger, but it also meant that the trial would likely involve detailed testimony about her manipulation tactics and the private details of her relationship with Michael. "Are you prepared for that?" Harold asked Michael that evening. Having all of this aired in open court, Michael was quiet for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "If it helps put her away and prevents her from doing this to someone else, then yes, I'm ready." The phone call came on a rainy Thursday morning in November, 3 months after the wedding disaster. I was in my kitchen, preparing Harold's breakfast before he left for work, when DA Walsh called with news that would reshape our entire understanding of Carmen Rodriguez's criminal network. "Mrs. Watson, We've been contacted by victims from 3 other states who saw the news coverage of your case, she said, her voice crackling with excitement. They want to testify at Carmen's trial, and their stories are remarkably similar to what happened to your family. She arranged for us to meet these other victims the following week. Harold, Michael, and I drove to the DA's office on Monday morning, uncertain what to expect. What we found were 3 people who could have been telling our own story. Robert Chen, the 72-year-old widower from Dallas, was the first person we met. Despite being the private investigator's father, he had insisted on attending the meeting in person. He was a distinguished gentleman with silver hair and kind eyes that reminded me of Harold, but there was a sadness in his expression that spoke of profound betrayal. She came into my life 6 months after my wife of 45 years passed away from cancer, he told us, his voice steady but filled with pain. I was lonely, vulnerable, and she seemed like an angel sent from heaven. She called herself Monica Chen, said the shared last name was a sign that we were meant to be together. Carmen had spent 8 months systematically draining Robert's life savings. She convinced him to invest in a fake catering business, claiming she wanted to start over and build something meaningful together. The $85,000 he gave her represented nearly his entire retirement fund, money he had saved working as an engineer for 37 years. The worst part, Robert continued, wasn't just the money. She made me feel alive again after Margaret died. She listened to my stories about the old days, pretended to be interested in my engineering work, even helped me tend to Margaret's rose garden. When I discovered it was all a lie, it felt like losing my wife all over again. The second victim was Maria Santos, a 58-year-old nurse from San Antonio. Carmen had targeted her using the name Jessica Martinez and had posed as a struggling single mother who needed help getting back on her feet after an abusive relationship. She rented the apartment next door to mine, Maria explained, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. She would come over crying, saying her ex-husband was threatening to take her daughter away if she couldn't prove financial stability. As a nurse, as a mother myself, how could I not want to help? Carmen had convinced Maria to co-sign for multiple loans totaling $43,000, claiming she needed the money for legal fees to fight for custody of her fictional daughter. She even produced fake court documents and had Rick Morrison pose as her attorney during phone calls with Maria. I worked double shifts for 6 months to help her make the loan payments, Maria said bitterly. I gave up my vacation time, my weekends, my own financial security because I thought I was helping save a child from an abusive father. The child didn't even exist. The third victim was perhaps the most heartbreaking. Thomas Bradley, a 45-year-old teacher from Phoenix whose wife had died in a car accident 2 years earlier, leaving him to raise their 12-year-old daughter alone. Carmen had approached him using the name Sarah Williams, claiming to be a fellow widow who understood his pain. She was so good with Emma, Thomas said, his voice breaking as he talked about his daughter. Emma had been struggling in school, acting out because she missed her mother so much. Sarah, or Carmen, I guess, seemed to have a magical touch with kids. She helped Emma with her homework, took her shopping for school clothes, even taught her how to braid her hair. Carmen had convinced Thomas to take out a second mortgage on his house, claiming she needed the money to pay for her dying mother's medical treatments. The $67,000 he borrowed against his home equity was supposed to be repaid within 6 months from her mother's life insurance policy. Of course, there was no dying mother and no life insurance. Emma still asks when Sarah is coming back, Thomas said, wiping tears from his eyes. How do you explain to a 12-year-old that the woman she had started to see as a potential new mother was actually a criminal who was stealing our house out from under us? Listening to these stories, I felt a mixture of rage and gratitude. Rage at the systematic way Carmen had destroyed these good people's lives, and gratitude that Michael's damage, while significant, was relatively minor compared to what these other families had endured. D.A. Walsh spread out a timeline on the conference table that showed Carmen's movements over the past 3 years. The pattern was chillingly consistent. She would establish herself in a new city, identify vulnerable targets through online dating sites, support groups, or community organizations, then spend 6-12 months building relationships before beginning her financial exploitation. What we're seeing here, D.A. Walsh explained, is one of the most sophisticated long-term fraud operations we've encountered. Carmen Rodriguez didn't just steal money. She stole hope, trust, and emotional security from people who were already dealing with profound loss. Robert Chen reached across the table and placed his hand on Michael's shoulder. "Son," he said gently, "I want you to know that what happened to us doesn't reflect any weakness or stupidity on our part. This woman is a professional predator. She studies people the way a hunter studies prey." Maria Santos nodded in agreement. "The FBI agent who interviewed me said that con artists like Carmen specifically target people with good hearts, people who want to help others, who believe in love, who give others the benefit of the doubt. Those aren't character flaws. Those are the qualities that make us human." Thomas Bradley pulled out his phone and showed us a photo of his daughter Emma. "I've had to explain to my little girl that sometimes people pretend to be something they're not to hurt others, but I've also told her that we can't let one bad person make us stop believing in the possibility of good people." As we prepared to leave the meeting, Robert Chen handed me a business card. "I've started a support group for fraud victims," he said. "We meet twice a month at the community center in Cedar Park. You and Michael are welcome to join us. Sometimes it helps to talk to people who truly understand what you've been through." Walking out of the courthouse that day, Harold took my hand and squeezed it gently. "Those are some incredibly strong people," he said. I looked back at the building where 3 strangers had just become allies in our fight for justice. "They are," I agreed. "And now I understand something important. We're not just seeking justice for Michael. We're fighting to make sure Carmen Rodriguez never has the opportunity to destroy another family the way she's destroyed theirs." January arrived with an unexpected phone call that would change the entire trajectory of our case. I was folding laundry in my bedroom when Harold appeared in the doorway, his face pale and his hand covering the phone receiver. "Patricia," he whispered urgently, "you need to hear this. It's Rick Morrison's attorney." Rick Morrison, Carmen's boyfriend and accomplice, had been sitting in jail for the past 4 months after being arrested as part of the conspiracy charges. His attorney, David Kumar, was calling with an offer that could make or break our case. "Mr. Morrison is prepared to provide full testimony against Carmen Rodriguez in exchange for a reduced sentence," Kumar explained during our conference call with DA Walsh. "He has detailed knowledge of her methods, access to recordings of their planning sessions, and information about victims we haven't even identified yet." The revelations that emerged from Rick's cooperation were staggering. He had been Carmen's partner for over 2 years, not just her boyfriend but her business manager in what they called Operation Lonely Hearts. They had systematically researched vulnerable targets across multiple states, with Rick handling the technical aspects, creating fake identities, forging documents, setting up shell companies, while Carmen handled the emotional manipulation. "They kept detailed records," DA Walsh told us during our next meeting. "Rick has provided us with spreadsheets showing their income from various victims, notes about each target's psychological vulnerabilities, and even scripts Carmen used for different scenarios. One particularly chilling document was titled The Reynolds Project. It contained a detailed psychological profile of Michael that Carmen had compiled over several months before even approaching him. She knew about his father's abandonment, his close relationship with me, his financial goals, even his favorite restaurants and hobbies. She spent 3 weeks observing Michael's routines before accidentally meeting him at that coffee shop downtown," DA Walsh explained. "She knew exactly when he took his lunch breaks, what he ordered, and even which table he preferred to sit at. The document revealed that Carmen had originally planned to target me as the primary victim, assuming that a 66-year-old widow would be easier to manipulate than her successful architect's son. However, after learning about Michael's income and savings, she shifted her focus to him while maintaining me as a secondary target for emotional leverage. She saw your relationship with your son as a weakness she could exploit," DA Walsh said. "Her notes indicate that she planned to drive a wedge between you and Michael once they were married, isolating him from his support system to make him more dependent on her. Reading these documents was like watching someone dissect our family under a microscope. Every kind gesture, every family dinner, every moment of genuine happiness had been calculated and cataloged by Carmen as potential tools for manipulation. Michael, who had been making significant progress in therapy, suffered a major setback when he learned about the depth of Carmen's planning. "She knew about my dad leaving," he said during one particularly difficult family session with Dr. Martinez. "She knew that was my biggest fear in relationships, and she used it against me." Dr. Martinez helped him understand that knowledge of his past didn't diminish the validity of his feelings or the real connections he had thought he was making. The emotions you felt were real, Michael. The love, the hope, the happiness. Those were genuine human experiences. The fact that they were manipulated doesn't make them less valid or meaningful. Meanwhile, Harold and I were dealing with our own emotional challenges. The trial was scheduled to begin in March, which meant we would need to testify in open court about our private investigation, our secret marriage, and the intimate details of how Carmen had infiltrated our family. "Are you prepared for the media attention?" D.A. Walsh asked during one of our preparation sessions. "This case has already attracted significant coverage because of the wedding day revelation. The trial is likely to be heavily covered by local and possibly national news." The thought of our family's private trauma becoming public entertainment was deeply unsettling. I had spent my entire career as an educator, maintaining a reputation for dignity and professionalism. Now, I would be testifying about secret marriages, private investigators, and family deception in front of television cameras. Harold, ever practical, hired a media consultant named Rebecca Torres to help us prepare for the public aspects of the trial. "The important thing," Rebecca explained, "is to stay focused on the facts and remember that you're the victims here, not the villains. The public narrative is on your side. You're the family who exposed a dangerous criminal." The preparation sessions with D.A. Walsh were intensive and emotionally draining. She walked us through every piece of evidence, every timeline, and every potential question the defense attorney might ask. Carmen's lawyer, an experienced criminal defense attorney named Marcus Webb, was expected to argue that Carmen was also a victim of Rick Morrison's manipulation and coercion. He's going to paint her as a battered woman who was forced into these crimes by an abusive boyfriend, D.A. Walsh warned us. He'll try to make the jury sympathetic to her situation while portraying all of you as wealthy, privileged people who can afford to lose the money she stole. This strategy particularly angered me. I had worked for nearly 4 decades to build the modest financial security that Carmen had tried to destroy. Michael had started his architectural career with student loan debt and had worked 60-hour weeks to build his savings. The idea that we were somehow privileged targets who deserved to be victimized was insulting and infuriating. Robert Chen, who would also be testifying, shared my frustration. "I spent 37 years as an engineer, saving every penny for retirement," he said during one of our support group meetings. "My wife and I lived modestly our entire lives so we could have security in our old age. These weren't rich people's problems. This was a working family's life savings." As the trial date approached, I found myself alternating between anticipation and dread. I wanted Carmen Rodriguez to face justice for what she had done to our family and to the other victims. But I also dreaded the public exposure, the cross-examination, and the possibility that somehow the jury might be convinced by the defense's narrative. "Remember," Harold told me the night before jury selection began, "we're not just doing this for us. We're doing this for everyone she might victimize in the future and for all the people she's already hurt who deserve to see justice done." I squeezed his hand and thought about Thomas Bradley's daughter Emma, asking when Sarah was coming back, about Maria Santos working double shifts to help a fictional child, about Robert Chen tending roses with a woman who was stealing his future with every passing day. "You're right," I said. "It's time to make sure Carmen Rodriguez never has the opportunity to destroy another family." The Travis County Courthouse was packed on the morning of March 15th when Carmen Rodriguez's trial finally began. Local news trucks lined the street outside, and I could see reporters setting up their equipment as Harold and I walked up the courthouse steps. After months of preparation, the moment of truth had finally arrived. Carmen looked different than I remembered from the wedding. Her honey blonde hair had grown out, revealing dark roots, and she wore a conservative navy suit that her attorney had obviously chosen to make her appear sympathetic. But when she turned to look at the gallery as we entered, I saw the same calculating eyes that had fooled my son for so many months. Judge Sarah Martinez, no relation to Dr. Martinez, presided over the trial with firm authority. Jury selection had taken 2 days, and we now faced 12 people who would decide Carmen's fate. 7 women and 5 men, ranging in age from their 30s to their 60s, representing a cross-section of Austin's diverse community. D.A. Walsh's opening statement was masterful. She walked the jury through Carmen's systematic approach to fraud, using charts and timelines to show how she had targeted vulnerable people across multiple states over several years. The prosecution's case was built around three key elements: the evidence of premeditation, the pattern of behavior across multiple victims, and the devastating financial and emotional impact on the families involved. Ladies and gentlemen, D.A. Walsh concluded, Carmen Rodriguez didn't just steal money. She weaponized human emotions, love, trust, hope, and compassion, and used them to destroy the lives of good people who did nothing wrong except believe in the possibility of human connection. Defense attorney Marcus Webb's opening statement followed the strategy we had been warned about. He painted Carmen as a victim of Rick Morrison's manipulation, arguing that she had been coerced into participating in the fraud scheme through threats and emotional abuse. My client is not the mastermind you've heard described, Webb told the jury. She is a young woman who fell under the influence of a manipulative and dangerous man who exploited her vulnerabilities and forced her to participate in his criminal enterprises. The first week of testimony focused on the technical evidence. FBI forensic accountant Jennifer Liu walked the jury through the financial records, showing exactly how money had been stolen from each victim and traced to accounts controlled by Carmen and Rick. The numbers were staggering when presented all together. $340,000 stolen from 7 victims over 3 years. Private investigator Jenny Chen testified about her surveillance of Carmen, presenting photographs and recordings that clearly showed her living a double life. The images of Carmen and Rick together at restaurants and shopping centers while she was engaged to Michael were particularly damaging to the defense's portrayal of her as a victim. But it was Rick Morrison's testimony that truly sealed Carmen's fate. On the witness stand, he appeared nervous but determined as he detailed their criminal partnership. His testimony revealed the calculated nature of their operation in devastating detail. Carmen was never the victim, Rick testified, his voice clear and steady despite obvious nervousness. She was the mastermind. She taught me how to identify targets, how to research their backgrounds, how to create the fake documents we needed. I was the technical support, but she was the brains of the operation. He described their business meetings where they would review potential targets, discussing each person's psychological vulnerabilities and financial assets. Carmen had developed detailed profiles not just of the primary targets, but of their family members and friends who might become secondary sources of money. She called it emotional archaeology, Rick testified. She would dig into people's past traumas and losses, then present herself as the solution to their loneliness or pain. She was incredibly good at becoming exactly what each person needed her to be. The most damaging testimony came when Rick described Carmen's reaction to the wedding day exposure. She wasn't upset about being caught, he said. She was angry that she hadn't been able to get more money from the Reynolds family. She felt like she had wasted months on what she called small-time targets. When it was time for the victims to testify, I watched the jury's faces carefully. Robert Chen's quiet dignity as he described losing his retirement savings clearly moved several jurors. Maria Santos's tears, as she talked about working double shifts to help a fictional child, brought visible emotion to the courtroom. Thomas Bradley's description of having to explain to his 12-year-old daughter that Sarah was never coming back left several jury members dabbing at their eyes. Michael's testimony was the most difficult for me to watch. He walked the jury through his relationship with Carmen, from their first accidental meeting at the coffee shop to the moment she shouted her accusation at the altar. His voice remained steady throughout, but I could see the pain in his eyes as he recounted how thoroughly he had been manipulated. I thought I was in love, he told the jury. I thought I had found someone who understood me, who shared my dreams and values. Learning that every conversation, every intimate moment, every shared laugh was part of an elaborate deception. That's a violation that goes beyond just the financial theft. When D.A. Walsh asked him about the impact of Carmen's crimes, Michael's response was powerful and heartfelt. She didn't just steal my money, she stole my ability to trust, my confidence in my own judgment, and my faith in authentic human connection. Those are losses that can't be measured in dollars. My own testimony focused on the family impact and the investigation that led to Carmen's exposure. I described the months of secret meetings with the private investigator, the agony of watching my son plan a wedding to a woman I knew was deceiving him, and the difficult decision to let the ceremony proceed so we could expose her crimes publicly. Why didn't you just tell Michael what you had discovered? defense attorney Webb asked during cross-examination. Because Carmen had spent months convincing him that I was jealous of their relationship, I replied. She had already started driving a wedge between us. If I had just shown him the evidence, she would have convinced him that I had fabricated it out of spite. Harold's testimony about our secret marriage and his role in the investigation was brief but effective. His calm, methodical presentation of the evidence reinforced the prosecution's case that we had been thorough and professional in our approach to exposing Carmen's crimes. The defense's case was weak and unconvincing. Carmen herself chose not to testify, which Webb tried to present as evidence that she was too traumatized by Rick's alleged abuse to face cross-examination. The few character witnesses they called couldn't overcome the mountain of evidence against her. After 3 weeks of testimony, the case went to the jury on Friday afternoon. Harold and I spent the weekend at home, trying to distract ourselves with normal activities while we waited for a verdict. Michael joined us for dinner both nights, and for the first time in months, he seemed genuinely hopeful about the future. The call came Monday morning at 10:30 a.m. The jury had reached a verdict after just 4 hours of deliberation. We rushed to the courthouse, joining the other victims and their families in the packed courtroom. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" Judge Martinez asked. "We have, Your Honor," the jury foreman replied. "On the charge of conspiracy to commit fraud, how do you find? Guilty. On the charge of grand theft, how do you find? Guilty. On the charge of identity fraud, how do you find? Guilty." The guilty verdicts continued through all 8 felony charges. Carmen Rodriguez had been convicted on every count, facing a maximum sentence of 25 years in prison. As the judge read the verdicts, I watched Carmen's face. For the first time since I had known her, she looked genuinely defeated. The mask had finally slipped completely, revealing not the charming woman who had fooled my family, but the calculating criminal she had always been. 6 weeks after the guilty verdict, we returned to the Travis County Courthouse for Carmen Rodriguez's sentencing hearing. The courtroom was once again packed, but this time the atmosphere was different. There was a sense of finality, of justice about to be served after months of legal proceedings. Judge Martinez had received over 30 letters from victims and their families, describing the devastating impact of Carmen's crimes. She had also received psychological evaluations, financial impact statements, and recommendations from both the prosecution and defense teams. Before announcing the sentence, Judge Martinez allowed each victim to give an impact statement. Robert Chen spoke first, his voice steady but filled with emotion as he described the ongoing financial struggles caused by losing his retirement savings. "At 72 years old, I've had to return to work part-time to pay my basic living expenses," he told the court. "But more than the money, she stole my faith in human goodness. She exploited the grief I felt over my wife's death and turned it into a weapon against me." Maria Santos, the nurse from San Antonio, spoke about how Carmen's deception had affected her ability to help others. "I work in pediatric care," she said, tears streaming down her face. "My job requires me to trust people, to believe in the good intentions of families bringing their children to us for help. She made me question everyone's motives, and that's affected how I do my job." Thomas Bradley's impact statement was perhaps the most heartbreaking. He had brought his 12-year-old daughter Emma with him, and she sat in the front row as he described how Carmen's betrayal had affected their family. "My daughter trusted this woman," he said, his voice breaking. "Emma had started calling her almost mom and was planning to ask her to adopt her. The psychological damage to a child who has already lost one mother and then felt abandoned by someone she thought would be her new mother, that's something no amount of prison time can repair." When it was Michael's turn to speak, he walked to the podium with quiet dignity. He had spent weeks working with Dr. Martinez to prepare his statement, and every word was measured and powerful. "Your Honor," he began, "Carmen Rodriguez didn't just commit financial crimes against me. She committed crimes against my future, my ability to trust, and my relationship with my family. She studied my deepest fears and insecurities, then weaponized them against me." He paused, looking directly at Carmen, who sat at the defense table staring straight ahead. "But I want the court to know that despite everything she took from me, she didn't break me. With the support of my family and professional help, I'm rebuilding my life. I'm learning to trust again, slowly but surely. She may have won the battle, but she didn't win the war." My own impact statement focused on the family dynamics that Carmen had tried to destroy. This defendant didn't just target my son's bank account, I told Judge Martinez. She tried to destroy the relationship between a mother and son that had been built over 34 years. She calculated that she could isolate my son from his support system, making him more vulnerable to her manipulation. I had prepared my statement carefully, but as I stood at the podium, I felt compelled to add something personal. I want Carmen Rodriguez to know that her greatest failure wasn't getting caught. Her greatest failure was underestimating the strength of a family that truly loves each other. She thought she could break us apart, but instead, she made us stronger. Harold's brief statement focused on the broader implications of Carmen's crimes. This defendant represents a particular kind of evil, he said simply. She preys on the fundamental human need for connection and love. She takes the best parts of human nature, trust, hope, compassion, and turns them into weapons. Society needs to be protected from people like Carmen Rodriguez. The defense had prepared their own witnesses for the sentencing hearing. Carmen's mother, a frail woman in her 70s, testified that her daughter had been a troubled child who had never recovered from her father's abandonment when she was young. A prison psychologist suggested that Carmen suffered from various personality disorders that made her susceptible to manipulation by stronger personalities like Rick Morrison. But these attempts at mitigation were undermined by the evidence of Carmen's calculated planning and the systematic nature of her crimes. D.A. Walsh had presented evidence that Carmen had been running similar scams since she was in her early 20s, suggesting that this wasn't aberrant behavior caused by trauma, but a deliberate lifestyle choice. When Judge Martinez finally announced the sentence, the courtroom fell completely silent. Carmen Rodriguez was sentenced to 18 years in prison, without the possibility of parole for 12 years. She was also ordered to pay $340,000 in restitution to her victims, though we all knew the chances of recovering that money were slim. Ms. Rodriguez, Judge Martinez said, looking directly at Carmen as she pronounced the sentence, "You have shown a complete disregard for the welfare of others and a willingness to exploit the most vulnerable members of our society. Your crimes were not crimes of passion or desperation, but calculated attacks on people who had done nothing wrong except open their hearts to someone they believed cared about them." The judge paused, allowing her words to sink in. "This sentence reflects not just the financial damage you caused, but the emotional and psychological trauma you inflicted on your victims. You weaponized love itself, and that is perhaps the most despicable crime of all." As the bailiffs led Carmen away in handcuffs, she turned one last time to look at the gallery. Her eyes found mine, and for just a moment I saw something that might have been regret, but it was too little, too late. Outside the courthouse, the media was waiting for statements from the victims and their families. D.A. Walsh held a brief press conference, emphasizing that the case demonstrated the importance of reporting suspected fraud and supporting victims of financial crimes. Robert Chen, Maria Santos, Thomas Bradley, and our family had decided to make a joint statement. Michael stepped up to the microphones, representing all of us. "Today's sentence sends a clear message that crimes against vulnerable people will not be tolerated," he said. "But more importantly, we want other victims of similar crimes to know that they're not alone, and that justice is possible if you're willing to fight for it." He looked directly into the cameras. "Don't let shame or embarrassment prevent you from reporting crimes like these. Smart, caring people get victimized by professional con artists every day. It's not a reflection of your intelligence or your worth as a person." As we walked away from the courthouse that day, I felt a complex mixture of emotions. Justice had been served, but the damage Carmen had done to our family and the other victims would take years to fully heal. Michael was making progress in therapy, but he still struggled with trust issues. The financial losses, while partially covered by Harold's generosity, had set back several victims' retirement plans by years or even decades. But there was also a sense of closure, of having fought back against someone who had tried to destroy us. Carmen Rodriguez would spend the next 12 years in prison, unable to target new victims, unable to weaponize human emotions against innocent people. Most importantly, our family had survived. Michael, Harold, and I were stronger than we had been before this ordeal began. We had learned that love and trust, while they can be exploited, are still worth the risk. 1 year after Carmen Rodriguez was sentenced, I found myself standing in the same church where our world had been turned upside down. But this time, I was there for a joyful occasion, the christening of Robert Chen's granddaughter, whose birth had brought new hope to his family after the dark period of fraud and betrayal. The support group that Robert had started had grown into something none of us had expected. What began as 6 fraud victims meeting twice a month in a community center had evolved into a formal nonprofit organization called Hearts and Guards that provided resources, counseling, and advocacy for victims of romance scams and financial fraud. Michael had become one of the organization's most effective speakers, traveling to senior centers, community groups, and law enforcement agencies to share his story and help others recognize the warning signs of fraud. His architectural firm had even begun offering pro bono design services for community centers that hosted fraud prevention workshops. "You know what's funny?" Michael said as we drove to the christening that morning. "I think I'm a better architect now than I was before this happened, building trust with clients, understanding their vulnerabilities, and protecting them. Those skills translate directly to my professional work." Dr. Martinez had been right about the healing process. Michael's recovery hadn't been linear. There had been setbacks, difficult days, and moments of profound doubt, but gradually, with consistent therapy and the support of our family and the other victims, he had rebuilt his confidence and his ability to trust. 6 months earlier, he had even started dating again. Sarah Kim, a fellow architect he had met at a professional conference, was kind, intelligent, and refreshingly honest about her own past relationship challenges. Their relationship was developing slowly, built on genuine compatibility rather than the intense, artificial connection that Carmen had manufactured. "I'm learning that real love is actually kind of boring compared to what I thought I wanted," Michael had told Harold and me during one of our regular family dinners. "There's no drama, no constant intensity, no feeling like I need to rescue someone or be rescued. It's just comfortable and steady and real." Harold and I had been married for over a year now, and our relationship continued to be a source of strength for the entire family. His business acumen had helped Michael not only recover financially, but actually improve his financial position through better investment strategies and business planning. The restitution order against Carmen had resulted in the recovery of approximately $85,000 from hidden bank accounts and assets that the FBI had uncovered. While this was only a fraction of what she had stolen, it provided some financial relief to the victims. Robert Chen used his portion to establish a small emergency fund for other fraud victims, while Maria Santos was able to catch up on her own retirement savings. Thomas Bradley had perhaps made the most remarkable recovery. His daughter Emma, now 13, had not only healed from the betrayal, but had become an advocate for other children affected by fraud crimes. She had started a blog called Teens Against Scams that helped educate young people about how to protect their families from fraud. "Emma understands something that many adults don't," Thomas had told our support group during one of our meetings. "She knows that the people who hurt us are the exception, not the rule. She hasn't let Carmen's deception make her cynical about human nature." The legal aftermath of Carmen's conviction had continued to unfold throughout the year. Rick Morrison had been sentenced to 8 years in prison for his role in the conspiracy, and his cooperation had led to the identification and arrest of 3 other accomplices who had been running similar scams in different states. D.A. Walsh had used our case as a model for prosecuting romance fraud, and she had been invited to speak at law enforcement conferences across the country about effective strategies for investigating and prosecuting these crimes. The Carmen Rodriguez case had become a textbook example of how victims, law enforcement, and the legal system could work together to achieve justice. As for Carmen herself, we had heard very little about her life in prison. The Texas Department of Criminal Justice had informed us that she was serving her sentence at the Christina Melton Crane Unit in Gatesville, and that she had been enrolled in various rehabilitation programs. Whether those programs would actually change her fundamental character remained to be seen. "I hope she finds some way to understand the damage she caused," Harold had said one evening when we received the update about her prison programs. "Not because she deserves forgiveness, but because maybe it will prevent her from hurting more people when she eventually gets out." The christening service was beautiful and peaceful. As I watched Robert Chen hold his granddaughter, seeing the joy and hope in his eyes, I was reminded that life continues to offer new beginnings, even after the most difficult chapters. After the service, our entire Hearts and Guards family gathered for lunch at a nearby restaurant. The conversation flowed easily between updates on everyone's recovery, plans for upcoming fraud prevention workshops, and normal family news, grandchildren, job promotions, vacation plans, and all the ordinary joys that make life worth living. Michael stood up during dessert and raised his glass of iced tea. "I want to make a toast," he said, looking around the table at this group of people who had become our chosen family. "A year ago, we were all strangers brought together by tragedy. Today, we're family brought together by choice." He paused, his voice becoming more serious. "Carmen Rodriguez tried to steal our futures, our trust, and our hope. She succeeded in taking our money, but she failed at everything else. We're stronger, we're wiser, and we're more connected to each other than ever before." Robert Chen raised his glass in response. "To survival, to justice, and to the families we choose." As we clinked glasses around the table, I thought about the journey that had brought us to this moment. The wedding that never happened had led to friendships that would last a lifetime. The betrayal that could have destroyed us had instead revealed strengths we never knew we possessed. Harold squeezed my hand under the table, and I looked around at this remarkable group of people. Victims who had refused to remain victims, survivors who had chosen to help others survive, and a family forged not by blood or marriage, but by shared struggle and mutual support. 6 months later, I would stand in a different church, watching Michael marry Sarah Kim, in a small, intimate ceremony surrounded only by people who truly loved and supported them. Harold would walk Michael down the aisle, symbolizing the new family bonds that had grown from the ashes of betrayal. The reception would be simple and joyful, with no elaborate decorations or expensive catering, just good food, genuine laughter, and the deep satisfaction of love that was real and tested and true. But that morning, sitting in that restaurant with our chosen family, I was content to simply enjoy the moment. We had faced the worst that human nature could offer, and we had not only survived but thrived. We had learned that while trust could be betrayed, it could also be rebuilt. While hearts could be broken, they could also heal stronger than before. Most importantly, we had learned that family isn't just about blood or marriage. It's about the people who stand with you when everything falls apart, who help you pick up the pieces, and who celebrate with you when you build something better from the ruins. If you've made it this far in our story, I want you to know that whatever betrayal or loss you might be facing, there is hope on the other side. Justice might not always come in the form you expect, and healing might take longer than you want, but both are possible if you're willing to fight for them. Please take a moment to like this video if our story has touched you. Subscribe to this channel for more stories of survival and hope, and leave a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. You're not alone in whatever struggle you're facing, and tomorrow really can be better than today. From Austin, Texas, where it's currently a beautiful Sunday afternoon, this is Patricia Watson, reminding you that love always wins in the end, not because it's stronger than hate, but because it's worth fighting for.